if you find a teacher on italki online or in your city or town, what you could do is now if you want to focus on speaking fluency, one great method that I use, okay, now this is the method that I use with my students. So if I get a student, every lesson is based on a topic. Now, some students want to focus on career topics. Other students want to focus on general cultural topics. Learn about history or learn about the culture of Europe or learn about anything general, so, food or travel or health or anything like that. And now if the student wants to focus on a career topic, it would be something about, engineering or law or IT, and then we would just find specific topics. If it's IT, let's talk about HTML or, coding in certain languages. So my job then is to find material for the student, and that could be articles or it could be videos, documentaries. So for me, the way that I do it is homework is always before the class. It's preparing for the class. So what I would do if it's a general topic, and just for example, if it's about the history of Ireland, okay, I would go and find an article about the history of Ireland or maybe a documentary, and then send it to the student. So now the student, and this would be 3 or 4 days before the class. Now the student has 3 or 4 days to study that article or study that documentary and, build vocabulary, use good study techniques, build those deep connections with the vocabulary. So it's basically like the student is gaining a lot of passive vocabulary, okay? There's a difference between passive and active vocabulary. Passive just means that you have a lot of vocabulary in your memory, but you never really use it. Active vocabulary mean, it's kind of like that vocabulary that you always use, because students seem to, well, even English speakers, we all seem to have this huge pool of passive vocabulary. If we can understand it when we read it, or we can understand it when this vocabulary when we hear it, but when we speak, we tend to use a smaller pool of vocabulary. And that would be your active vocabulary. And for a lot of students, what they do is they use that small pool of English active vocabulary to explain every situation or every idea or topic that they want to talk about. They use that small pool. But basically, going back to this method, the student studies the article or the documentary. They build their vocabulary. Now it's passive, okay? So all of that vocabulary goes in. Now when they come to class, my job as a teacher, and I recommend if you find a teacher, try and find a teacher who's willing to use this method. And I'm sure there's a lot of teachers out there who use very similar methods, but this is just the method that I use. So when the student comes to class, my job as a teacher is to get the student talking about the topic as much as possible and to get them using all of that new vocabulary as much as possible. And my job is to kind of be as quiet as possible as well. There's a lot of teachers who kind of want to talk a little too much. And so the secret really with teaching like that is to, try and be as quiet as possible, keep the conversation going, get the student talking for an hour. And then, I would just, make small corrections on pronunciation and grammar. And then the big thing is also suggesting natural language that the student can use. So whenever the student makes a mistake, I could, kind of suggest the best language possible for what the student is trying to say. So think of it as, there's a huge amount of input. The student studies the material, the topic about Irish history. Then they come to class, they talk about Irish history or the topic. And, now they're creating the language. So that, to me, doing that week after week after week, it's one of the best methods to improve fluency. Okay, because every week it's like a huge amount of input. And then for 1 hour, it's a huge amount of output with corrections. And then week after week after week, going through that process is, for me, it's one of the best ways to hold vocabulary. Because if you only read, and if your teacher talks a lot and you're only listening in class, the vocabulary is only going in, the information is only going in, and it stays there. You never get to use it. So for me, a big thing is, the vocabulary has to go in, but then in class it has to come out. And then what happens is that once you use vocabulary, what I suggest to my students is that they try and experiment and try and use as many new words as possible as they can. Okay? So, you're trying to build that small pool of active vocabulary and trying to encourage the student to experiment and use other words. So hopefully that pool of vocabulary gets bigger. And when you use a word in the future, that word, you're going to remember that word quicker if you've used it before. So that's the biggest method for me. Now, you could find a teacher on italki, or you could just find, like a language partner, like someone else who wants to learn English, or a friend that is learning English, and you could both just agree to, you'll find some article or documentary, you'll both study it before you talk, both study it, build that vocabulary, then, call each other on Skype, and then just both of you talk about, give yourselves each enough time to speak about the topic. And that's one great, but the only problem there is that you're not talking to a native English speaker, so there's going to be no one to correct your language or suggest, the best language to use. So now another method for me, like if your teacher is willing to do this, is what I do with my students. See, that first method it's basically a lot of study, and then when they come to class, it's trying to talk about the topic for an hour. Now for higher level students, that can be easier. But for lower level students or intermediate, what I would do is, generally in that situation, I would send them an article, okay? And then, they would study the article in the same way, creating those strong connections with vocabulary and really creating those mental representations, really understanding the topic as much as they can. And normally what I suggest is that they try and do extra research if they have the time, but if they don't, it's okay, just study the article. Then come to class, and then in the class, then what I would do is kind of focus on paragraphs. So it's not talking about the topic for an hour, it's kind of like, if the student wants to focus on, if one of their goals is to improve their listening fluency, what I would do is just read the paragraph for them, and then just get them to listen to me reading that paragraph. And then for them, it would be listening comprehension. It's a listening comprehension exercise. So I would read the paragraph, they would sit back and listen to it, understand the story, and then after the paragraph, I would ask them questions about the paragraph. So tell me, like, I would ask them, okay, so what did they mean here when they spoke about this? Or do you agree with this? Or, I could also ask them, like, could you give me a summary of the paragraph? And then after we finish discussing that paragraph, we go down to the next paragraph. And then I read that for them. They listen, they understand it. And then after reading it, I get the student to talk about the paragraph. So what I recommend to the student is that they try and retell or explain the paragraph using their own words, but trying to use as much vocabulary from the paragraph as possible, or as many expressions from the paragraph as possible. To do it in a way like a combination of their own words and vocabulary from the paragraph. So, and then we just keep going down the paragraph, keep going down paragraph by paragraph until we finish the article. So that's another way to do it. And see, that specific exercise is very good for, here's another thing about that, is that when the student needs to describe the paragraph or talk about the paragraph, it has to happen from memory. It should only happen from memory, because that's what speaking fluency is. Speaking fluency is retrieving vocabulary from memory. Words, first of all, you kind of know or can imagine what you want to say. Now you need to retrieve the vocabulary as quickly as possible. And if the vocabulary is connected to mental images, you're going to retrieve it quicker. Now, to say what you want to say, you need to put it in a kind of like good structure for the person to understand. So speaking fluency is a very difficult thing to master, but it's just about doing it as much as possible. So, but it's very good for short-term memory and something called working memory, because if you listen to me reading a paragraph, there could be 150 words in that paragraph. Now, directly after listening to me reading that paragraph, now you have to remember all of those 150 words, and talk about the ideas in the paragraph. It's really good for your short-term memory and working memory. So there's a benefit there as well for your memory. But anyway, so now what I also do in lessons is do the same thing but using video. So we would find some career topic and I would find a video based on a career topic, something like jet engines. You know, if it's a student who works in aviation, we would study a short little video about jet engines, you know, going through all the different parts of a jet engine. Or if it's a cultural topic, it could be something like, sometimes I've used like David Letterman interviews, or any, you know, any video that the student wants to work on. So they would study the video before class, creating deep connections, visual representations of the vocabulary, becoming very familiar with the topic in the video. Then when they come to class, what I would do is, you know, I would share the screen with the student in class, and I can share the screen and the sound. So generally I share the screen of the video and then press play, and they can hear the sound as well. So I press play and then let it play a little so the student can hear just, you know, maybe 10 or 20 seconds, press pause. And then I ask the student, you know, okay, so what are they talking about? Can you give me a little summary of what they're talking about? And then after I get the student to talk about that short section of the video, you know, I go to the next 10 or 20 seconds. And depending on the level of the student, you know, I would, if the student is at a lower level, you know, I would only play maybe 5 or 10 seconds. If the student is at a higher level, I could play 30 seconds or a minute, or, you know, even 2 minutes. And then after 2 minutes, we would have a discussion about the 2 minutes. So, and that there is focusing on short-term memory as well, or working memory. And then it's kind of like all of that vocabulary is going in, and then you have to talk about it, so the vocabulary comes out. So to me, that is speaking fluency. It's kind of like input, output, input, output. The first method is large scale input, output. You know, it's study a full article and then come to class and for 1 hour talk about the article for 1 hour. And then there's short scale input, where it's, you know, read a paragraph, talk about it, read a paragraph, talk about it. You know, it's short input, short output, short input, short output.